programs representative for the board. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. Janet Michelson Gariahu, and I head the program committee for the board. And we hope you keep your eye on the door because we always have posters, and we have a lovely group of really mostly authors for the spring season as well. But we're honored today to have Dr. Daniel Mark, who is a professor of political science at Villanova, to speak about his first book, which is an award-winning book published recently by the press of the University of Notre Dame. And here we are.
Great, thank you so much. Is it, I'm sorry, take the podium or? what-
Wherever.
Oh, you're okay. Up in the middle. Thank you so much. It's really, really nice for all of you to come out on this rather brisk evening. So thank you for joining us. As you heard, I'm Daniel Mark, associate professor at Villanova. I'm in the political science department, along with my colleague here, Marcus Kreutzer, and I teach political theory, legal theory. It's kind of the area where this book comes from: politics and religion, law and morality, those sorts of courses.
And a relative, and a resident of Balkan.
Yes, and I was going to say, yes, I was definitely coming to that. I'm involved at Villanova, just some parts of the university that have been a part of my time there. The Ryan Center, or for the study of free institutions and the public good, which also actually from time to time has, it's a little bit, down the main line, down Montgomery, but also has some good public lectures from time to time. The McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy at the law school. I'm also involved with the Navy ROTC battalion there. I'm not in the military, but I try to advise and participate in a variety of ways. The other thing, just as far as who I am and my interests, I mentioned politics and religion. I did spend, while I was still part of Villanova, spent 4 years on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a small federal agency that advises the President, Secretary of State, and Congress on U.S. foreign policy related to religious freedom abroad. That's not what I'm speaking about tonight, but it kind of gives you a sense of my interests and my efforts. I do want to say a great thank you to the library staff, to Autumn and to Janet and to everyone else who helped arrange this and make it possible. Printed out. There's flyers as well for the book, which is kind and generous. The idea came from just being the fact that I live in Ballykinwood and I go to this library. I bring my boys to this library. We love coming here, and I thought it'd be maybe a nice thing to do, to offer the opportunity to come share some of my thoughts with all of you. This is my book. They were kind to call it award-winning. The award that the book won is the University of Notre Dame Press, who published the book, their first-time author award. So it's an award they give to one of their first authors from that year. Very, very honored to have that award. Don't get me wrong, but I don't want to. They want a Pulitzer or something like that. just to be very clear. And the book is dedicated to my sons, who I do love to bring here. I quote some real literature, since we're at the library, from Dr. Seuss's Horton Hatches the Egg, which is a favorite. And the line that I quote, the publisher, for intellectual property reasons, wouldn't let me put it in the dedication, but I snuck in a short quote in the acknowledgments. And so you get the full version here. Did he run? He did not. Horton stayed on that nest. He held his head high and he threw out his chest, and he looked at the hunters as much as to say, shoot if you must, but I won't run away. I meant what I said and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. That is the most important thing in my life, much more than the book and much more than Villanova, is trying to be a good father and set a good example for my boys, including many of the virtues that we learned from Dr. Seuss and from the other wonderful literature that we get from this library. So let's talk about the book. Again, very thankful to the University of Notre Dame. If they're watching, very thankful to the University of Notre Dame Press for a really, really great experience working with them. And also, I do think the book looks actually beautiful. I always like to say, out of gratitude to the press, I will ask everybody to buy a copy. I'll ask nobody to read a copy. And so, and it does, it looks very pretty on the shelf. And so, if anyone's interested, there are in fact flyers up here with ordering information and a coupon code for a discount. Though the website of the press itself usually has a better discount code, like a seasonal, Christmas gift kind of code or something, so be aware. So the book. I like to joke, as I do at the opening of the book, that legal philosophers mainly care about two kinds of laws: traffic laws and Nazi law. Those are our two favorite topics, and it's all over philosophy of law. So why traffic laws? Well, let's begin with the case of the mythical traffic light. You come to, well, we were just talking about Indiana, where Notre Dame is. There's probably more of this in Indiana than there is in the Philadelphia area, but you come to a traffic light in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere. And it's clear in every direction. And the land is flat over there, and so you have a clear view. There's enough moonlight or maybe street lights or whatever it is. So absolutely confident that there are no other cars, there are no pedestrians, there are no animals, wild animals running across the street, no deer, or anything like that. And it's a red light. What do you do? What do you do at the red light in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? Okay, well, what do you do? Anybody want to weigh in? What do you do? Anybody want to confess? What do you do?
I drive.
You drive, yeah.
First you stop.
Do you stop and then drive?
I stop, I look, I check if there's a camera.
Okay, yeah, okay, so good, that's very important, and by stipulation, we'll say no cameras in this example. So we're going, yeah, anybody else, our contrary view? Anybody sit and wait?
Stop
Yeah,
and wait
yeah, okay,
for a while.
there, stop and wait.
And then you would.
Right, and so then the question is, right, and assume it's not broken light, in which case, like the red forever, we're not doing that, right? So thinking about our own reactions to this, there's a psychological question, which is, what do we do, and why? What's motivating us? Why do some people go and some people stop, kind of thing? That's one question. Then there's a sociological question, like what do most people do? What are either the practices in our society with regard to those situations, or just what would surveys show that most people would say about themselves and their own behavior? What I'm focused on in the book as a legal philosopher is the philosophical question, and I would say for our purposes, the ethical or moral question of what's the right thing to do at the traffic light. No judgment, of course, of anyone, but what's the right thing to do at the traffic light? Do you have an obligation to stop at the light? And if so, why? And we say obligation, now I know someone's gonna ask, and you should ask, do I mean a legal obligation or a moral obligation? And for our purposes, again, and if, my intention, I think, is I don't want to lecture at all for an hour. So I'm going to speak for less than that, and then we can have questions, conversation, and maybe I'll even sit if that's okay. And so people may want to ask about that. But for our purposes, I'm going to say, let's agree that there's a legal obligation, that you're supposed to, according to the law, you're supposed to stop at the red light. The question is there any moral obligation behind that?
But I'll ask you a question.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. What about the notion that if you go through this red light, whether it's a full one or a flashing one?
Yeah.
And we won't, this question about what does a flashing red light mean?
Right.
But the psychological implication that you'll go through the next red light.
Yes, so I love that question, and it's actually very important. For the purposes of the case of the mythical traffic light, we're going to rule that out too, so that we get the pure case. And I'm going to say in a minute what I mean by the pure case and why that's important. But absolutely, one of the considerations is you do it at 3 a.m. What about next time it's 3 p.m? And you're like, well, I can see, we're not always the best judges in our own cases, as it were, and you kind of get a little too habituated to making your own decision about whether this stop sign's worth stopping at or not, and then the next thing you know, there's a problem. So that is a very important question, and it may even be a more important question if you say the very fact that there's no such thing as making that choice in real life without the further implications, as Aristotle would say, the character shaping implications of each of our choices, then it may very well be that you can't really have the pure case, and that may actually be a real point against this kind of example. Yes.
Does the municipality have a responsibility at 3 o'clock in the morning, nowhere in the world, to put on a negative leaking light?
Right, so great question, and there's actually a debate, I won't get too far sidetracked, because make sure I can give people something to take home, but. There is a real debate among legal, I tell you, we love our traffic laws, right, a real debate among legal philosophers over what the law is. So I hedged a little bit when I said, remember, let's just agree for now that it is a legal obligation. So let me switch the example and then come back to your example. Legal philosophers really care about the following question: is the speed limit the number on the sign, or is the speed limit the speed at which people actually get pulled over, right? So you're on 95 in Pennsylvania, it says 55 miles an hour, but everybody knows you can go up to, I don't want to scandalize anyone, let's say 62, is that okay? Let's say 60, right? So, right, so people say like, and that's why there's no cop pulling you over, there's no prosecutor who's gonna prosecute that under 62, there's no judge. Right, well, maybe, right, and that's a question too, right, is it really, so now your example, is it the expectation of the law that you in fact wait at the red light at 3 AM, right? Or would you say, if the legislatures had this question in front of them at this moment, they'd actually say, no, of course we didn't need for you to stop, and the fact that we didn't have a blinking light, for whatever reason, resources, technology, whatever it is, you can understand that we just expect you to stop and look and then go, right? Do a Mrs. Springer, right? And instead of actually, so you're right, there is another side that says you don't even have the legal obligation because you should just they want you to treat it like a blinking light, even if there's no blinking. And that's not uncontroversial, but it's really what you're asking, and it's a great question. The case of the mythical traffic light gives us the pure case, as I was saying, right? Because it gives us a case where there's no reason to obey the law other than the fact that it is the law. So normally at a traffic light, we've got, a bunch of considerations, but at least two very basic ones. One is safety, and one is efficient flow of traffic through the intersection, like taking turns in an efficient way that's quicker than everybody decide for him or herself, kind of a free-for-all approach, which could work, but is maybe less efficient. But by stipulation, we've ruled all of the factors out in the case of the mythical traffic light. There are no other cars at all, no pedestrians, no animals, there's no safety concern, no efficient flow of traffic concerns at all. Which shows us that one of the questions we're asking about the authority of law, at least from this, is whether the authority of law depends on the reasons behind the law or just the fact of it being law. And then if it's the second one, well, what does that mean? Why is there authority of law by virtue of it being law, as opposed to just the reasons? And there are extremely important, prominent legal philosophers who think, well, it's basically about the reasons. And so if there's rules about how a pharmacist prescribes drugs, but a pharmacist knows better than the FDA, and there's an off-label usage, and then that pharmacist should not be restricted by the legal regulations, because the reasons don't apply in that case, because that person really knows better. Caveat question, of course, you get in the habit of thinking you know better, definitely an issue, absolutely. And traffic laws are a really good example for this that we can't get in certain other kinds of law, as I'll say, because traffic laws have no inherent moral behind them in the specifics. Now, I'm not claiming, I'll explain that, but I'm not claiming that there are no morals behind the traffic laws. Like, we really care about human life and well-being and safety and efficiency and taking turns and fairness and all of that. And traffic laws help accomplish all of those things. But our specific settlement of this intersection doesn't have to be a traffic signal, right? It could be a stop sign, a yield sign, a roundabout, or it could be what they've done in some experimenting. We're going to just take everything out and tell people just be cautious at the intersection. And sometimes that works better, depending on the circumstances. Not saying I recommend it, but sometimes maybe that works better. So in the case of, let's say, a murder law, even if there were no law against committing murder, you'd have an obligation, freestanding moral obligation, not to commit murder. in the absence of the traffic light, you don't have an obligation to stop at that corner. You have an obligation to be careful, not to be reckless with respect to other people's safety, but you don't have an obligation to stop and wait for something. You can maybe just slow down, see the clear intersection, and keep going. Similarly, in the absence of a law that has a speed limit, you'd still have an obligation to be responsible with your motor vehicle, but not an obligation to keep it at 55 or 62 or whatever else it is. And so these cases of traffic laws give us an opportunity to test whether the obligation to obey the law applies when the reasons behind the law don't apply. So in the case of the physical traffic light, the reasons behind the law don't apply. In the case of a murder law, you're never going to have a situation where the reasons behind the law don't apply because it's still going to be wrong to murder. Not kill, but murder. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Got it. So that's the fascination with traffic laws. They give us the ability to imagine these cases where there's no inherent moral norm built into that specific law. There are background norms which you could fulfill in other ways, like just be careful again. And we can come up with this case of the traffic light in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, where you've got no reason to stop other than the fact that it is the law. Yes.
You drive with a license, a driver's license, gives you permission by the state, by the authority to travel on those roads.
Right.
So if there are laws of driving connected to your driver's license, isn't that an element of going to that traffic light and linked to your behavior on that at that intersection or otherwise?
Are you asking whether by operating with a license, I'm accepting all the laws as conditions of operating with a license?
There's a kind of linkage to that, isn't there?
I suppose there is, but the question is, what is the source of my requirement to follow those rules?
But you've been given a driver's license and you have to obey those road conditions and so.
But just because those are the rules.
Like terms of agreement.
Right, so it sounds to me, yeah, that's right, it sounds to me like you're saying, it doesn't matter what the rules are, because you've consented to them by operating with a license. By once you accept the driver's license, to drive the driver's license, and yeah, that's totally fair. I think, a simple answer to that is, have you in fact done that? Is there anywhere when you accept your license where you sign, I hereby agree to follow all the rules of the road? Now, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, I honestly can't remember what I may or may not have signed, but I got a driver's license, but even though I probably read it at the time.
You do, you have to take the course.
But
I take the course.
yeah, but taking the course is different than saying that, than saying that, like,
means you know
there's a
doesn't mean you
contract, right? Are you breaking a contract if you're, yeah, I mean, I certainly think there's a linkage, but is it enough of a linkage that creates an obligation that's gonna stand when none of the reasons behind the law apply? That's the question. And maybe it does, the answer might be yes, but it's still a question. Our second category, as I said, Nazi law. Now, why is Nazi law a favorite topic of legal philosophers? Well, going back to antiquity, so kind of for as long as we have had, law in Western civilization, certainly going back to the Romans and in other versions prior to that as well, there's an ancient maxim that an unjust law is no law. An unjust law is no law. It gives us St. Augustine, who is our patron saint at Villanova. And so I fulfilled now a contractual obligation by having St. Augustine during my talk, has a famous line that's variously translated, of course, but as like, without justice, what are kingdoms but great robberies? Right, so the government without justice is just that.
Or Pennsylvania.
And so, or
Legasign morbis vanae. Law without moral, legasign morbis vanae, I'm between the Latin.
oh, yeah, I didn't realize you were saying, yes,
Sorry.
but yeah, good.
Yeah.
So exactly, thank you. It's good, always good to have experts in the room. Right, so the idea of this ancient maxim, an unjust law is no law, the idea that law is related to justice and law without justice isn't law. But then legal philosophers look at Nazi Germany and say, but surely Nazi Germany had law. I mean, you might not like the law, okay, fine. But would anybody, an alien coming in from another planet have any problem identifying a legal system in operation? I mean, there were probably traffic laws in Nazi Germany, I imagine, and probably most of the people obeyed them, and and then all other kinds of laws too. Right, which gets us to a branch of legal philosophy, and in fact, not only legal philosophy, because there's a related concepts in a variety of fields called positivism, which actually doesn't come from the word positive that we say like positive versus negative, but from the verb to posit, as in to put forth. So when we talk about positive law, we don't mean positive, not negative. We mean laws that are positive, laws that are written, basically the laws that we make. Normally contrasts with things like the moral law or the natural law, which are laws that just exist that we don't have to invent them. They're just built into the universe, almost in a way like the laws of physics. Like the law of gravity is just there, right? Nobody invents it. They just discover it. Yeah.
So you're talking about natural law versus laws that are positive law. But there's kind of a gray area there, I think, because, for example.
Oh, no, that's fine. That's not where, hold on. That's not where I'm going with this at all. But so, yeah. So yeah, let's just do that. I'm happy to do that in the questions. But I just don't, no, that's fine. I don't mind at all. In fact, it's fun when it goes in different directions. But I don't want to lose the thread here just for a minute. So the idea of the positivists is that we can identify law without respect to moral criteria or normative criteria, evaluative criteria. That it doesn't matter whether it's good law or bad law, whether it's just law or unjust law, we can still tell that it's law, right? So thinking back to American history, we've got the fugitive slave law, awful and wicked and egregious and everything else like that. But nobody has a hard time seeing that it's law. It's still law. So what do we mean when we say is an unjust law, no law, just kind of like an outdated idea before people realized that there was wicked law that was still law and we could tell just fine? What makes law law? Is it some kind of descriptive, which is to say non-moral criteria, or is it some kind of normative, which is to say moral criteria? Now, for the old positivists, those who came, I guess, in the generations just before one of the authors I'll talk about, so, putting ourselves, let's say, 100 years ago, some of them talked about sovereignty and obedience. So the sovereign is he or she who is habitually obeyed and habitually obeys no one. That's kind of a classic positive definition of sovereignty, the one who everyone obeys. That's the sovereign. And law is the commands of the sovereign. And again, what you see from there, and I'm not hung up on that too much. I'm not going to say, I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but I bring that up to say that we can all see that gives us non-moral criteria for identifying law. So if the sovereign if the King of England commands it, it is law. He commands it, it's good. He commands it, it's bad, just, unjust. But the king commands it, and it is law. And maybe he writes it down, and he signs it, and stamps it with his ring, stamps it in wax with his ring. Whatever the rules are, that's how we know what law is. And at no point do we stop to ask, is this a good law or a bad law? That's a positive way of thinking about it. Other positivists from that time thought about law in terms of punishment. And in fact, in some cases, primarily about the punishment, that law is the rules that carry sanctions, punishments, and in fact, for some of them, again, so much so that the sanction was the real law part of the law. And again, not our main concern. And in the post-war period, in the middle part of the 20th century, Herbert Hart, H.L.A. Hart, wrote this extremely influential book called The Concept of Law.
Post World War II.
And yes, this is like 1960, yeah, or 1961 maybe. And he deals with questions related to that, which we may or may not get to. But he says, well, okay, he's got a lot of problems with thinking about law as commands or law as punishment to that, and he wants to think about law as social rules or rules based in social practice. And again, those were interested more in the difference between A and B. more than welcome to ask. But again, he's still sticking to his positivism. Because he's saying that the law are the rules that we recognize as laws around here. Again, something that, so in our case, we might say for federal law, if it's passed by both houses of Congress and then signed by the president, right, that's, we all know this from right elementary, that's how a bill becomes a law, right? And again, so the criteria for identifying law aren't tied to questions about the morality. They're just tied kind of to the process, to the form, to what Hart calls the rules of recognition, which is, it's a very kind of a self-evident name in a way, the rules we use to recognize law as law. And each system will have its own, so it might be in England, it has to be passed by a majority of parliament, and then, or whatever the situation might be in that case. Now, I tell you all of this to bring us back around to traffic laws, because Hart, in his very memorable early part of the book, also talks about traffic lights, not the mythical traffic light, but just traffic lights. He says, here's where the old positivists got it wrong. The ones who thought about law as commands and punishments is that for them, they're like looking at the traffic light from like hanging, now we can say maybe like a drone or something like that, but just from kind of the bird's eye view, as it were, in more old fashioned language. They're thinking about law from the external point of view, where I look down on this intersection and I see the red light as a sign that people are going to stop. That is to say, I observe the intersection and I know that this red signal is tied to a regularity of behavior. That the light is red and people stop. And he says what they're missing is what's called the internal point of view. That is from the perspective of the person following the law, who understands him or herself to have a reason to stop. It's not just a sign, the red light is not just a sign that I will stop, but it's a signal for stopping. It's an instruction to stop, not just a prediction of my behavior that I will stop. And he says they're missing, and by thinking about it as commands and punishments, they're just thinking about what people do, how people react, but not how they, from the internal point of view, see the law. He makes a distinction between how we treat a mugger and how we treat the law. So it says if someone holds a gun to you and demands your wallet, you might be, to use his special word, obliged to turn over your wallet. But if you get away for whatever reason, you create a diversion and you escape, or whatever the happy circumstances are that you get away without turning over your wallet, no one thinks you've done something wrong, right? No one thinks you have violated an obligation to turn over your wallet. You are obliged, but not obligated. Whereas at the red light, or with which traffic law of your choice, we don't think you were obliged in that sense that there's just somebody with a gun to your head, though in a sense, there was a punishment that's being held over you, but that you, from the internal perspective, obeying the law, see yourself as obligated, not just obliged, but obligated, such that if you avoid complying, like you run the red light, you have done something. Where we have the sense that you've broken a rule that you should have followed in a way that with the mugger, you haven't broken a command that you should have followed, you just got away and lucky you. And here's where it all adds up. Because I don't think that Hart can make that claim work. Because Hart, as you remember, I don't think his theory holds together. Because Hart, as you remember, is a positivist. So Hart thinks that we can understand law and define law without normative criteria, without respect to questions of goodness and justice, right and wrong, all of that. That there's rules, we have a rule of recognition in our society, it's passed by Congress, it's signed by the president. There's a sort of social rules, social practices that give us our rules. But I think that if that's Hart's definition of law, his concept of law, I think Hart is unable to account for his other key point, which is that people relate to the law not like they relate to a mugger. People relate to law as though they're obligated. It is at the same time, Hart wants to say that we all view ourselves as obligated, and also wants to say that we can understand the law totally apart from questions of justice. But if that's the case, why do we see ourselves, what could possibly be the source of obligation to obey if we understand law without respect to justice? And I think that my theory was confirmed in advance by, again, that great doctor of philosophy quoted before, Dr. Seuss, because and I forget the year, I should have looked this up on the way in, but it's a new book, so I haven't done this enough times. In 1973, so about a dozen years after the publication, he wrote the following. And he mentions our author by name, so this is not a stretch. Just suppose you were poor Herbie Hart, who has taken his Thron's emulator apart. He never will get it together, I'm sure. He never will know if the gig or the gourd fits into the scrubs or the snucks of the steward. Yes, Ducky or Lucky, you're not Herbie Hart, who has taken his Thron's emulator apart, right? So I think Dr. Seuss read the concept of law and had the same thought that I did, right? That Hart says we've got to start over, right? That the people who defined law before I did had it wrong. I mean, he's against the natural lawyers who want to have a concept of justice in the law. And he's against the positivists who came before him. He says we kind of deconstruct the whole thing, build it up again, and he does, but he can't get that Thron's emulator back together because there's this fundamental flaw, I believe, where Hart is saying again at once that the central concept of law is obligation, but also we understand law apart from questions of justice, and I think that just leaves it impossible to explain for him where the obligation comes from. Yes.
This obligation, it's more like, almost like a personal obligation.
A moral obligation.
Yeah, that
like
the individual feels himself for whatever reason.
Well, feels and or actually has, it doesn't just feel.
Right,
Yes.
yeah,
Right. And then if what he wants to say, and I do address this in the book, if he wants to say that they feel it but don't have it, then he's kind of arguing for a mass delusion, right? That everyone in society believes they have an obligation to obey the law and nobody does. And that would be a very,
Not turning the tap off.
that's not an impossible solution for Hart to offer, but it's a very unsatisfying one. I don't think if we land there, I don't think we've landed in a very good place. Now, and as I said, also, he doesn't think commands work, he wants rules. And so what I want to do, and this allows me to just tell you what the thesis of the book is that my concept of law, the way I want to define law is as a set of commands oriented to the common good. And here's, and hence the subtitle of the book, The Nature of Laws, Authority, Obligation, and the Common Good. Mainly maximized for like the search algorithm on Amazon or something, but also a good subtitle for the content of the book. I think there's two parts to what I've just said. Law as a set of commands oriented to the common good. Well, let me start with the second part, I suppose. So I want to join those who reject positivism. I want to join those who reject positivism and say that law must be connected to justice. That if we don't have if law isn't connected to justice, and in this case to the promotion of the common good, then we cannot get the concept of obligation to obey the law off the ground. There just won't be any way to explain why we have an obligation unless we're connecting the law to moral obligations we already have. And then also in the first part, law is a set of commands. So I think that this is a very uncontroversial, unpopular view of mine, but sometimes that helps, that I want to go back to an older way of thinking about law as command, not to adopt the positivism of the positivists who think of law as command, but I think as the form of law, I think command is better than rules, because we want to say, if we agree with Hart, as I do, that obligation is central to law, that we have to understand law in terms of obligation, that we don't relate to law as a mugger, as a gunman with a gun to our head. If we do, then we need, then I think that the idea of command, which suggests obligation, right? That someone who commands intends to obligate, whether they do or they don't, they intend to obligate. And so I think that if we connect kind of the form, the shape, the structure of command with the orientation to the common good, which is kind of the content, the substance, I think putting those two parts together gives us a sound definition of law. Again, the orientation to the common good, because it connects us to morals and to justice, and command, because that's a better placeholder for the kind of thing that leads to obligate. Commands lead to obligate. Rules are rules. Rules are all kinds of rules. You know, there's manners, there's customs, there's all kinds, whereas command is an idea that, at least in theory, on paper, is very connected to obligation. I will just, as a footnote, before opening it up, say that one danger, I'll flag a danger for you, something to give me a hard time about, if you want to, is that if I'm right in my definition of law, and I do address this extensively, maybe satisfactorily, that's for the reader to decide, but it would mean that the obligation to obey the law, the authority of law, would not depend on consent. Right, and in America, some of us, maybe all, for those who are Americans at least, are familiar, with the Declaration of Independence, at least from school, which Thomas Jefferson wrote, drafted, drawing heavily on John Locke, talking about the consent of the governed. And if I'm right, the authority of law depends on the law's orientation to the common good, and not necessarily on the fact that we've consented to anything. Now, in my defense, I'll say preemptively two quick things. There's a lot of problems with consent theories in general, starting with except if anyone here is a naturalized citizen of the United States, none of us ever consented. If you're naturalized, you took an oath. The rest of us kind of born into it, and that was that. Or just here and have not been born into it and are living here and have consented to nothing, perhaps. The driver's license is relevant now again for the record. And the other thing is that I think that we all already accept that we have many moral obligations that fall on us independent of our consent, such as the moral obligation not to kill another person with our car. You may consent to that, you may not consent to that, but I bet if we have a sane crowd tonight, I think, right, we all think that we just have that obligation just by virtue of being here. And God or no God too, that's not a theological claim in any way. I mean, some people want it to be a theological claim, but for my money, that would be true even if God didn't exist. So that would be my very short back of the envelope defense of the fact that I am in fact claiming that the authority of law doesn't depend on consent. But so having said that, having given you an avenue for attack and perhaps having prompted, I hope, other questions along the way, I will thank you for your kind attention. And if you don't have questions, then I'm going to talk about the post-war trials of Germans and all of that, and I've got more stuff. But let's get everybody in. Yeah, thank you. Yes, please.
So
I'm sorry. Would you just tell me your name also?
Lori,
Okay.
sorry, Lori.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I couldn't help but hear the word command because I've always been under the impression, correctly or incorrectly, that all of our laws somehow stem from the 10 Commandments. And I'm just curious, your thought about that.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't phrase it. I would not endorse that. I'm not saying you are either, but you're saying that's what you heard. I wouldn't endorse that expression of it. I think it's certainly true that the legal legacy of the 10 Commandments and the Bible more generally has been very important for the development of law in Western civilization. And in fact, that's why, if you look around like the relief at the top, like in the Supreme Court, inside in the courtroom, you see a bunch of figures, like including Moses, right, as one of the great lawgivers of history. And then there's other great lawgivers of history. And also why in the very interesting, in the politics of religion stuff that I love, the very interesting debates over the 10 Commandments, either in schools or on public, like government property, right, in front of a city hall or something like that. Some of this debate goes into the role of the 10 Commandments in developing our history and developing our law. Having said that, right, I mean, obviously some of the things that are in the 10 Commandments are also in our laws, like thou shalt not commit murder. But I think, again, for my money, those things would be in the law anyway. Had there never been the 10 Commandments, there still would have been a law in America in 2024 against murder, if there would be in America in 2024. But you know what I mean. Yeah, go on. Did you want to follow up?
Yeah, so to follow up with that, last spring, our police station runs a Citizens Police Academy.
Cool.
It's very cool if you ever get a chance to do it. And we had a prosecutor come in and he was explaining, and again, I hope I'm not misquoting him, that so if you're talking about, let's say, murder or what have you, right? So we have thou shalt honor thy mother and father.
Right.
So, for example, the murder of, God forbid, a child is considered much more severely in terms of punishment than the murder of your peer, let's say. Okay. Right, so that's why I think so, if I heard him correctly. And again, I'm not quoting him, right? So
Right,
But
yeah, I would just say, yeah, and even if, and like, I don't know what the specifics of the law are on that, and also would vary from church, because also murder laws, are generally state by state. I think we could agree that there's like we have a general cultural norm that harm to a child is worse than harm to an adult, though they're both bad, of course, right? Yes, but right, so I mean, if we're gonna like think about, obviously, and we're actually just today in politics and religion, we were looking at a study done actually by the government commission that I was on blasphemy laws around the world. Back in there were about 70 countries in the world, believe it or not, that have laws against blasphemy, right? Connecting in the Ten Commandments, not taking God's name in vain, and those sorts of things. But none of those things are in our law, right? Or not coveting. None of that's not in our law. So we kind of have like a half and half with the Ten Commandments. But I think it would certainly be true that the moral and legal legacy of the Bible has been very influential in Western law. I mean, that's sure. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Robert. My question is, the authority of law depends on I'm gonna quote you. The authority of law depends on the common good, but is that really the correct way to look at it? Or is in fact a moral basis, which then leads us right to follow up her point, leads us right back to God again?
Good. So short answer to the question, yes, but so when I say, or meaning that the authority of, and this is I didn't, we'll do a second talk and I'll go into what I'm talking about with the common good, but the idea is that the law's role in advancing the common good, which is something which we all have an obligation to participate in advancing the common good, or at least creating a legal system that does, is really where the obligation comes from. So it's not, so I wouldn't say it's not a difference between, it's not either common good or something moral, because I'm actually putting those things together. Now, the second implication of your question is that we can't really have these moral norms without tracing it back to a divine commander, as it were. And that's something I actually don't accept. It's not actually among, I'm sure everyone in this room could identify me as Jewish. This is not a majority opinion necessarily among Jewish scholars, but I would be of the view, which I would defend as a Jewish view, in fact, that there are morals independent of divine command and independent of the law. And in fact, there's a passage of the Talmud that I'm quite fond of, that I won't quote it word for word by memory, but in the English is something like it's discussing, the Talmud is discussing different synonyms for why a single verse in the Bible would have different synonyms for the word law, statutes, ordinances, that sort of thing. You're like, why do you need to like have so many synonyms in a row for what seems like the same thing? And it gives this in Jewish law a classic distinction between two different kinds of law, which I'll say like the rational and the non-rational, and if not non-rational, that's not irrational, but non-rational. And the line of the Talmud that I'm getting around to now is that, and these are things that if they had not been written, would have been written, which is to say they'd be wrong anyway, even if the Bible had not commanded them to be wrong. And so I would defend it as a Jewish view, but if I'm wrong, I would still defend it as the right view. That sounded a little bit sacrilegious the way I said it, but that we have moral obligations. So the philosophical view that I adhere to would say that I accept that the biblical passage about human beings being created in the image and likeness of God is a very good religious source for racial equality, and a very good backing for racial equality. But I would argue, and again, this is me, I'm not claiming this in the name of everybody else, I would claim that on the basis of morality grounded in human nature, racial equality would be true and correct and good, even in the absence of God. So if God didn't exist, we would still have a moral obligation to uphold racial equality and not to racially discriminate, or worse, is the moral view that the philosophical view that I subscribe to, but I'm indicating, in fairness, that it's controversial. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No,
it's right on this. We can.
No, well, I mean,
yeah.
Okay.
So what was the sort of socioeconomic and religious background of some of these logical positivists in law? I mean, the reason why I'm asking, I just read this wonderful book on on Vienna, and Vienna also had a lot of logical positivists, right?
Yeah.
And they had two characteristics, that they were Jewish and upper bourgeois.
Uh-huh.
And they tried to apply this positivism to the study of society. Think of Popper and people like this.
Okay.
And the core notion is very similar to what you described in the traffic law. They thought that if you want to study society, facts can speak for themselves, right? That anything other than facts, anything like theory, you know, you have to ignore because it's external, it's subjective.
Sure.
And so they insisted very harshly on this distinction between facts and theory. And one of the motivating factors were that they were Jewish and bourgeois. In the sense that if you were a Jewish scholar, right, and you proposed any theory and any empirical findings, the far right dismissed it as a Jewish theory. If you were upper bourgeois, right, the Marxists dismissed it as a Marxist theory. So the motivation
As a
for
non.
As a bourgeois theory, yeah,
As a
yeah,
bourgeois
yeah,
theory,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, of course.
So one of the motivations is to separate anything external, any theoretical.
Yeah.
Was to sort of avoid being canceled by the far right and the far left.
Yeah, so yeah, I you know, often in class, I'll say like, we're not gonna, not that you're wrong to, but we avoid psychoanalyzing the authors so that we just take the arguments on their merits. Not because you're wrong, again, like, you know, so Hobbes, who has this idea of kind of like this absolute power ruling government, but he lived through the English Civil War, and he knew what it looked like when the king goes down, and you know, things got really, really bad. And of course, it's better to have an authoritarian in charge than to have nobody in charge. So we can fairly psychoanalyze authors. I mean, in this case, in thinking about legal positives from that time, you would have, in Germany, you have Hans Kelsen, and in the Anglo world, we think of Jeremy Bentham and John Austin. Unless I'm wrong about Kelsen, to my knowledge, none of those three are Jewish. I would assume they were all bourgeois, but I actually don't know too much about. I mean, there would have, you know, there was much more.
Kelsen was in Vienna.
There was, what's that?
Kelsen was
In Vienna, okay, right, so there was much more like, you know, class stratification in those days in general, so you didn't really have, people from the lower classes as prominent philosophers, obviously. But yeah, that's worth looking into, it's a good insight, thank you, yeah.
Two things. One, just since you were talking about Hobbes, it's worth noting that the other side also happens. I'm fairly certain you're familiar with the Abarbanel or Brabanel, but you know, he was a Jewish scholar and whatnot, and he, you know, comments on the Bible, and he basically says he's extremely anti-monarchist, which is not necessarily controversial, but in the Bible,
It's a minority opinion.
it's not a minority, but there's an even split, because the one hand in Deuteronomy it says appoint a king,
Right.
but then in Samuel it says Samuel gets annoyed when they ask a king, and God says essentially they didn't reject you, they rejected me. So God's kind of endorsing that we shouldn't have a king.
Sure.
So there's a whole, every Jewish philosopher and their mother all have an opinion on this. So the Abarbanel, extremely anti-monarchy,
Okay.
very, very much. And it seems like, you know, this is, you know, a valid opinion, but he had the opposite spirit of Hobbes. He was exiled by, I think I might count 3 different countries by kings. He was exiled from Spain,
Right.
1492, exiled from Portugal, maybe for another
Yeah.
one. And so you know, Hobbes' influence is basically saying we need a big man in charge to make sure that things don't devolve into
Sure,
anarchy.
yeah.
Abarbanel's like, we can't trust anybody in charge because they're always gonna, you know, pull power, absolute power.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah, so it's fair, yeah, I mean, in a way, it's a fair demonstration of my point that that we'll just have to take the arguments on their merits. And certainly, I mean, thinking of this kind of as a teacher and all of that, right? Like it's too easy to fall into the tendency to dismiss an author for background reasons or something, you know, well, he's just saying that because of that. Now, maybe he is, and maybe he's wrong, but maybe he is and maybe he's right. And so, yes, that's kind of my approach, although in fairness, like the way Mark is saying, like you could also miss things if you don't know that, so that's fair.
The other thing that I mentioned this, you know, at the beginning, was you talked about kind of like natural moral law versus social law.
Positive law, yeah.
Positive law.
Yeah, sure.
So we take natural law as kind of a given. We all agree that, you know, murdering somebody.
Well, we don't all, but yeah, go ahead, yeah.
You know, people who kind of hold to natural, you know, say that the cold-blooded murder of someone is, broadly speaking, bad. And people would say that, you know, taking property that does not belong to you is, broadly speaking, bad. But what about the moral law or natural law? can change. Like, broadly speaking, I don't know how many thousand years ago you want to go back. People would think that, it is self-evident from the Lord in heaven that certain people are better than other people. And certain people are closer to God and are smarter and are wiser and are pure and whatever. And that wasn't a positivist thing. That was moral law. Everyone knew it. Similarly, everybody
Right,
knew.
I get it, yeah.
A couple of years ago that certain types of, sexual relationships were okay and certain types were simply not okay. And that was a morally accepted natural law.
Yeah.
That's changed.
So, right, so I would say, yes, okay, so now put me down for a second, we've got another follow-up on the other, another one on this, because that'll be a whole hour too. But yeah, so this is a great topic that, again, it's great in class as well, because, the students often bring up the same kind of objections. The short answer to that, just given the time, is that people's views change, but that doesn't mean that the natural law changes. So right, it could very well be, so like, again, what I would argue is that, of course, views differ today and certainly different over time about racial equality. And that's an example I always use in class, because usually,
We all kind of live it.
among us, right, like, it's not really controversial, right? I mean, meaning our agreement on racial equality is probably not, of course, I don't know all of you, but making probably safe assumptions. And we all think, I bet, that people in different times and different places who have a different view about racial equality are just wrong. It's not because the moral law changed. Now, how culpable are they? Well, there's a lot, okay, could they have known, should they have known? That's a thorny question, how responsible do we hold them? But it's not because we look back and say, oh, when those people owned slaves, it was okay. No, it was just as wrong then as it is now. And maybe they're more or less culpable, again, depending. And in the same way, again, just this is an analogy, it's not an identity, but an analogy, is that's true in the past about knowledge of math and knowledge of physics. Like, none of us think that in an earlier era, in ancient times, when they were a little bit off about the value of pi, right, that 3.14159, et cetera, right? That's not because the value of pi changed, that's because people were wrong. And so just as people can be wrong about mathematical truths or scientific truths, like spontaneous generation, the germs just perfectly know, right? All those, right? People were wrong about what they thought. There was a truth that was as true then as it is now, and they were just wrong. And I would say for certain moral claims, that's true. Now, not everything is subject to an exceptionalist moral norm like that is, but that would be the.
So,
Yeah,
basically-
wait, hold on, I might have a follow. I think there's a follow-up right
Well,
here just on that.
Well, yeah, but the problem you have with that is, let's take the founders.
Sure.
Right? We worship them,
Yeah.
like demigods, I guess maybe, although if you go to
Some
Washington.
do, some don't.
Although if
Yeah.
you go to Washington, DC, you see Washington in the apotheosis in the Capitol, that may not even be, a demigod may not even be right. But, their view about what was consent. And their view of, after all, the Declaration of Independence is not law.
Correct.
It's simply a statement
Mhm.
that they made when they revolted from England,
Sure.
whereas the Constitution is law.
Sure.
But the point that disturbs me about what you're saying is that, then where's the moral law come from?
Okay, good, yeah, and I will go home happy knowing I disturbed someone, so I take it as a compliment, I once, one of the best, had a student, now years ago, a wonderful student, she walked up and said, Dr. Mark, I'm so mad at you. I was like, oh, why are you so mad? She's like, because I used to know what I think, and now I don't know what I think, and I said, you couldn't have paid me a better compliment, so, right, so the answer.
Because the common good or the moral law that the 18th century. Yes, there were things that we say now are wrong, but at that time, they thought were okay.
Yeah, so again, I was just.
And that's the derivation of the Constitution and of the law that comes from that, recognizing that law is not just statutes, it's judges, it's administrative agencies, it's
This one.
this one, I won't get into that conversation. But the source of law is of many different things. And the basis of whether it's the common good or the moral law, and I have problems with both of those concepts, but you're using them as different, but they're the same, but they're different.
Yeah, so there again, I think that I think so the answer to like the meat of your question at the beginning of like where does it come from is I mean, either from God or from nature, right? And that's why, and in that sense, I would associate with myself, just pulling out the Declaration of Independence, to try to make sure that I quote it correctly, though this, I mean, a part that I'd like to think I know by heart. But right, when in the course of human, the beginning, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which connect them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth separate equal station, to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. So that's what I'm a nature and nature's God. So I think that, I mean, in my particular circumstances, I believe that God exists. I believe God gave these commands. I believe God created a universe that has these rules. But I also think that if God doesn't exist, the moral conclusions we're drawing from the facts of human nature are also correct. Which reminds me of a point that I wanted to say in response to Dr. Kreutzer's question, which is that, and without, of course, disputing anything you said, but adding to it, a lot of those people, it sounds like, were very influenced by David Hume, right, who was a very famous philosopher not too long before that time, who has this famous fact-value distinction, and this idea that we actually separate facts and values, that you can't derive values from facts. It's also known sometimes as the is-ought distinction.
I mean, moral values.
That is one thing and ought is another thing. We're not going to get into all of that tonight, except to say that certainly the natural lawyers, not real lawyers, natural lawyers are making a different claim about that, right? That in fact, and there's different camps of different schools of natural law too, but in fact, that there are moral principles, I guess you would say, like embedded into the fabric of the universe, the way that there are like physical laws that are embedded into, and they're there to discover, and they're true. Of course, we have the free will to disobey them, and the way we don't have free will to disobey, like the law of gravity. Yeah, right on this, or yeah.
I mean, can I follow up on your question where you sort of were troubled, where do these laws come from? I mean, if you try to replace positivism, who believes that he can understand law on its own terms, right?
Yeah.
By then replacing it with God and nature, you're becoming a de facto positivist on your own terms, because in one sense, both of them sort of have an essentialist view of what you're studying. One is that law in and of itself has certain unchanging essential characteristics that can be understood and give us a rationale why we have law.
Yeah.
And you're just replacing that with that God has an internal logic that is unchanging and universal that can be understood, or nature. So you're replacing one essentialism, a more empirical one, with a metaphysical one.
Right, so that's probably, yeah.
Where's the improvement?
And
Yeah.
everything is subjective to people's interpretation. Even if you think it's a natural law or a Bond's law, it's subject to.
Well, but it's a denial of that, right? It's, I mean, so the question would be, right, do you think that the question of racial equality versus racial inequality is subjective in that sense? That like, who's to say and nobody can know? Okay, right, so that gets you very close to a kind of moral relativism that says actually, like, or to quote a famous movie, that's just like your opinion, man, right? So right, and that would be a form of moral relativism, which I don't think that, you know, someone goes into like someone's house and shoots their whole family, and then the survivor of the family view is like, well, agree to disagree. Like, you have a moral view, you did something wrong. Right, so I think like with slavery in America, I gave the claim that I would make, you know, the natural law side, is that there's a right answer and a wrong answer. And not every question has a right answer and a wrong answer, but some questions do. Yeah, wait, hold on. So I will be happy to spend, I'm very good at ending on time, so that people aren't kept prisoner longer than they want to be. So I'm gonna say thank you to all of you, to make sure that anybody who needs to go can go. And if anybody wants to yell at me for a few more minutes before I have to go, that will be perfectly fine. But it is really like it's an honor to have me here. I'm so honored that people would come out. I'm nobody, so have you come out and talk to me.
So I just to follow up on what she was saying.
Yeah.
I'm
Sure, and there's flyers ready.
I'm kind of with her, where some of
Yeah.
your examples, I have zero legal thought, like I'm
Sure.
an English major, this is a lot over my head. You're picking very examples that are very, to me, cut and dry.
Yes.
So my colleagues and I, a few weeks ago, took a test of how blue is this? We all stared at a screen. It was kind of like being at the eye doctor. It would
Sure.
change slightly. And none of us could agree on how blue, this blue we were staring at was, because we can't, it's our version, our opinion. So is not morality the same, like your level of moral obligation the same?
No,
If
so.
it wasn't the red traffic light, we all are told we're taught to stop. If it wasn't so cut and dry, would you find us having the majority?
Right, no, the traffic light's a different example, right? That's, so the traffic light is not.
Okay, so the racial equality.
Right, so there, I think, yes, I think the argument is, and I'm not expecting you to accept it at this stage, the argument is that that is as true as whichever thing you want to say is true in, and then the Pythagorean theorem, right? A squared plus b squared, there's every right triangle follows that formula. The sum of the square of the sides equals the square of the hypotenuse. That's just always going to be true, and you will never find a right triangle. That's a math, and it's not relative, it's not subjective, it's not anything else like that. Now, of course, living in the deeply Humean and positivist influence world that we live in, Hobbes was also one of the first big positivists in his own way. It's very hard for us to get our heads around the fact that that moral truths could, in a way, be like mathematical or scientific truths. That's very hard to get our heads around. But I think, first of all, I think it's right. But second of all, deep down, most of us actually think that and live our life. That's the point of the racial equality. Because you're right. I don't want you to think that every example is like this, and definitely not how blue is this. Nothing like
Right,
that.
is your blue my blue? Probably
Right,
not.
and vanilla is not objectively better than chocolate or anything else like that, right? But there are certain moral norms that are really right, and they're contrary being really wrong. And if we don't see that, we don't see that. But that doesn't make it less true in the way that thinking germs, arise, or the maggots on the spoiling meat come through spontaneous generation, and not understanding that microscopic particles. That's also wrong. And that's the claim. I'm not saying that that you're gonna accept that. And again, the point of using the cut and dry, as you say, examples like racial equality is like, I think deep down that's what you think too. That's really true. That racial equality is really true. And it's not subjective, and it's not like there are people in a different time or place who had the opposite view of you, but they were also right. Is my sense. Yeah, I'll go back here.
Are you suggesting then that law cannot evolve?
No, of course it can. I'm saying there are certain bedrock moral principles that will always be true, and law can evolve, and it can also evolve in the wrong direction. So for example, our law has evolved enormously on the question of racial equality, and in our case, largely for the better. Happy to say, but you can pick a different issue. I don't pick something you don't like in our law. I think it's evolved, and whichever hot button social issue is your thing. What's that?
The Nuremberg laws.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Things could evolve in the wrong direction, right? And I'm sure, given the heated political environment that we're in any case, like we can all, whichever side you're on, right? I'm always, like I say, in class, I'm always keeping an equal opportunity, right? Like both sides think the other side is doing crazy things with the law, right? And so,
The Nuremberg example is an interesting one because of the fact that, in fact, there was this whole legal structure in the Third Reich that was derived from previous German structures.
Yes.
But they had judges, they had lawyers.
Yes,
they
and
had
so Hart says,
prosecutors, they had trials. I mean, it was a whole.
So part of Hart's thing is, we've got a puzzle. How could we punish people for things that they did at the time that they were legal? I mean, he's not the first person to think of that, to be sure, right? But part of this book is, what about the post-war German trials? So people are on trial for laws they didn't break, right? Things that they did that were legal at the time that they did them. And I think, for the reasons that I was saying, that I think he's missing the point, because if there's no moral obligation to obey the law, then what's their defense? You were following the law. You didn't have I think the real quandary is when you take my view that there's a moral obligation to obey the law because the law's orientation to the common good. And then you say, well, in that situation, they did have a reason to obey the law. And now they had a stronger reason to disobey the law. But at least there was, I also think this helps explain civil disobedience. One of the things we normally think about civil disobedience is that you break the law, but you break the law openly and accept the punishment, right? Martin Luther King wasn't a fugitive, right? He marches in Birmingham and then he sits in jail, right? The famous letter from Birmingham jail. We all know he was in jail in Birmingham, right? And so And I think that again, that whereas he may have had a stronger moral obligation to break the law, it was weighed against a perhaps lesser obligation to obey the law. And when you add that together, right, that helps explain the norm of, well, you're gonna break the law, and that was the right thing to do, but also accept that in the process you did something wrong. Maybe, yeah, well, the fellow behind you also wants, but yeah, no, I mean, you can go ahead, but I just wanna make sure he has a chance, yeah.
Well, I'm just gonna say, all right, let's take a more controversial example.
Yeah.
Abortion.
Oh, go ahead, what do you wanna say?
Well,
Everyone's wrong.
different people have different views of what the
Sure.
what the morality, what the moral basis of that decision.
But notice that all of those people agree with me that there's a right answer to that question, not with Mrs. Frager, right? All the people, not all the people, of course, right? But all the people who you hear talking about, right, one side thinks that there's an inviolable right of the child not to be killed in the womb, or whichever language, whatever language you want to use. And then one thinks there's an inviolable right of the mother to exercise, the pregnant woman to exercise her bodily autonomy, my body, my choice, right? And both are asserting essentially a natural, on both sides, we are asserting a natural right to, and saying that the other side, the side that either wants to permit the ending of fetal life, or the side that wants to restrict the bodily autonomy of the mother, both sides, each one thinks the other one's violating somebody's right.
So,
Yeah.
you mentioned, it seemed to me that when we talk about natural law, it's like natural law, however you look at it,
Whatever, yeah.
is unchanged. It's true, we don't know what it is, so
Sometimes.
natural law doesn't necessarily evolve, but it's our understanding of it.
Like the laws of physics, right?
Right, so like, so we didn't know, 500 years ago, people didn't know that, 500 years ago, people didn't know that men and women were really equal. Women were considered like
Right.
objectively lesser, that was what they thought, now we know that that's.
But really, they're morally equal.
Yeah,
Right.
so, but, I guess, what's that?
We still don't know it.
Some people think
Well,
so,
some people.
but they're wrong.
Okay, right.
I mean, that's my claim.
Oh, yeah.
But I guess the question is, and this might be kind of very broad and I don't really expect to have an answer, but how do we figure that out? Like, right now, we're sitting here and we, even if we don't have the arrogance to say, our understanding of natural law is absolutely perfect,
Yeah.
and we know it's true, even if we say our understanding may be flawed, we still work with, what we have. How can we kind of handle it to say that, like,
Yeah.
it's gonna evolve, it's gonna change, how do we deal with that? Because we don't know that what we know now is correct. Like, if you, Mr. Robert, I don't know your last name, your example on abortion, assume that there is some kind of, somewhere in that debate, there's an actual natural law correct answer. We don't know what it is now, how do we deal with it in the interim?
I mean, the answer is, philosophy, right, is that we have to continue, and when I say philosophy, I don't just mean like the philosophy for the scholars, I'm saying, right, like the process of observing the world and thinking about the world and trying to find, which is why, as I, again, was just saying very recently to the students, we hold our convictions with a combination of certainty and intellectual humility. Right, which is to say that I don't think we should be radical skeptics about everything we believe in. Like, who knows, maybe 5 years from now, we'll find out that we're wrong about racial equality and racial equality is terrible. Like, maybe if I'm a betting man, which I'm not betting on changing my mind about racial equality, but or society, our society writ large, in that sense, we're going back to the way it was 150 years ago or 50 years ago or whichever. But absolutely, we absolutely have to have the intellectual humility. I forget, just to I spend so much of my day, with the students, and it's the way I think of vocationally a teacher, and so it's how I think about things, is that you should not go through college without changing your mind about at least one serious question, right? Like either you failed or we failed you, right? And I say, and I think about myself, my views on the use of nuclear weapons, my views on the use of capital punishment, like serious ethical questions, right? Like, I think that my willingness to be open to arguments about things that I didn't previously believe, has allowed me to see a different perspective and consider the fact that I might have been wrong. And I say that, this is not applicable to this group, but because if you don't change your mind, what are the odds that you as an 18-year-old already have the right view on every serious moral question that could confront you, right? Like,
Like,
just
just 18, but now they're 42.
right, just unlikely by the odds, right? And so, yeah, but so I think that, you know, this comes to maybe either the work of actual philosophers or the work of people experiencing the world and being open to the possibility, you know, being open to perspectives. This is also why people who take the kind of views that I have are also so deeply committed to concepts like free speech. Because if we don't have the opportunity to be confronted by contrary views, we'll never think our way out of the paper bag, right? So either whether we change our mind or refine our understanding of our previously held views. And so, yeah, as a reminder, everyone is already dismissed. So just in case, but this is very flattering. Yes, hello.
Thank you, Professor.
Yes.
Can you reconcile the doctrine of historical presentism, which suggests that it's wrong to judge past actions against our present values with the idea that there's eternal values?
Do you mean judge as in judge them to be or wrong, or judge them to be culpable for holding those views? Which one are you asking?
Judge them to be wrong.
So yeah, then I would take a side and say we can judge with the intellectual humility to know that we can be judging wrong. But again, I confess, I absolutely judge historical racists and slave owners. Like, I mean, maybe this makes me like, I don't know, weaker isn't the word, or maybe it's worse. Maybe this makes me arrogant. Maybe that's what it is. But like, if deep down in my heart, I really judge them. Now, on the question of right and wrong, the question of culpability, there's more wiggle room because again, we say in every case, how responsible were they to know? Now, I think that even among certain people, there were actions that were taken, like you should have known, right? Holding, you know, inegalitarian views on race is not the same thing as like, God forbid, like lynching someone or something. Like you still had to know that was wrong. I'm sorry, right? I really judge you, right? Like I judge you culpably as well, right? But yeah, then I'd be prepared to say in a way, and again, I'm using the science analogies because something we can relate to. Like I really think that people who believed in spontaneous generation were just wrong. And I think everybody here thinks that too.
But they weren't culpable for it because it's like,
maybe to varying degrees.
I mean, like, you know, the guy, you know, the proverbial guy in the street, you know, in 1000 CE, wherever there was a street, they couldn't be held culpable for believing, like, they didn't know who they were illiterate, you know, but like, you know, whereas, you know, theoretically, Aristotle or whoever, or you know, the natural philosopher could have had perhaps some culpability, but even so, it can't be that much because without the scientific method, it's hard to figure that out.
Absolutely, yeah, sorry.
No, I just wanted to say, so what do we do with laws that seem unjust to us now?
Try to change them. Yeah.
I think we have to obey them.
Oh, well, so you might, so the answer might be what I was alluding to before, you might have to engage in some of disobedience. And again, I was for the students, again, this, you know, there's a distinction between an unjust law and an unwise law, right? It's like, and I usually, again, for their purpose in college, like, you might think the drinking age is stupid, but you're not about to crack a beer on the lawn of the Radnor Police Department, right? So, and so,
I desperately want an abortion. And it's illegal.
Right, so I think, right, okay, so there, right, there's a little bit of a trick in the setup there, just in that, you would think if a situation where you thought you had a moral obligation to do otherwise, as opposed to like, I would like to do this, but the law prevents me unjustly, is different from saying, it's not the exact same thing as, so
I feel like I have the moral right.
Right, so I'm distinguishing slightly between moral, so I'm basically conceding the point, I mean, conceding like it's the right question. I'm making a slight distinction between having a moral obligation and a moral right. So let's say I believe, so we can I want to ask your question with just a stronger example, so I'm saying. Mm-hmm. So let's say, think about Villanova again, it's time of prohibition, and there's no exception for sacramental wine. And so now Catholics can't, I mean, forget about, there's a wafer and a wine and you can do with one, but let's just say, right, there's no exception for, and not like the Jews who can substitute grape juice on Friday night or something, right?
Only one something.
So like you might say, right, I've got a moral obligation to celebrate the mass, which includes the use of wine, whatever, and then, yeah, and then in that case, the answer might be civil disobedience. Would be, I think probably would be, well, first, I mean, try to change the law. That's like in Letter from Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King kind of, I don't mean to demean this, it has a checklist. Of course, that sounds like a overly informal way to put it, but you know, have you gone through this process of a variety of steps that are required before direct action, which is his term there for civil disobedience. And I think step one is try to change the law, and then step two, in the right circumstances, is break the law. There's always, and this is in Aquinas and everywhere, is there's always a prudential judgment, which is to say a judgment call when it's kind of like a more minor problem, like you're weighing breaking the law and all the things that come with that, not only consequences for you, but let's say like bringing down the system. Like, would you bring down the system to fix an unjust law? That's not a really big deal, let's say, or something like that, as opposed to, so, Aquinas says there are certain situations where you always have to break the law. Like if it's basically, if it's like, if you're being asked to violate the 10 Commandments or something like that, right? Then you've got no choice. But if it's kind of like a thing where there's, it's a less big deal, you gotta make a judgment call, but, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, say one more, how about that?
Yeah,
Go
okay,
ahead.
so I'm just trying to think of how to formulate this question. So if you have, so you talk about like civil disobedience, where it's like, more of the King's example, where it's like, there is some obligation, broadly speaking, to follow the law, even if the law is kind of unjust. And and there's perhaps a greater obligation that you disobey the law, but then you have to accept kind of, I'm going to perform civil disobedience, nonviolent resistance, whatever, and that's the right thing to do, but I therefore accept that if I'm doing this, I'm gonna go to jail, and that's, kind of part of the deal. What about the case where, you have like, you think I have a moral obligation to do the following, for whatever reason, you want to get an abortion. And, and it's like, but you don't think that, you don't say that I'm gonna get an abortion, people don't think I'm gonna have an abortion illegally, and then I will accept the consequences and go to jail, because that's just what the law, there's something different that I can't see.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. What is the kind of the secret law breaking, is that ever justified?
Why is it that one is like, you do it and then you have to accept that you get punished, and one is like, you do it and you don't think, now I accept going to jail.
So my short answer is I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure that's a good category, that I do it, like I object to these this aspect of my taxes, and I'm just gonna cheat and not tell anybody. I'm not sure that that's a justifiable category.
I'm not even saying you don't tell anybody, like you say that, let's say you tell somebody, I did this, I did this, you lack,
Right.
but I still don't think it should be punished.
But you don't do it publicly in the, right, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
I think that might be the wrong way to think about it. It's the right question. It might be that for very understandable reasons, we don't think that mothers who have just given birth or just had an illegal abortion should be going straight to prison. But I don't think that's because,
Some people see it.
but I'm saying, but I don't think that's, but I'm not sure that's because we have a justification for distinguishing them. So,
And then we should say that, that just seems really wrong to us, and we're not gonna do it.
Yeah.
To some.
Yeah.
Some people would say it's not wrong, okay, or it is wrong.
all right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.